Hi, I'm Jim Likens. When people ask me what I do for a living, I tell them I'm a storyteller. I'm not the type that might show up in a library on a Saturday morning or in a kindergarten classroom. You see, I tell the story of people's lives. Been doing that for a long time as a video producer and film producer. And what I wanted to share with you was not the greatest dad in the world, but a dad with problems and a dad that was bad. You see, my father was one of those World War II veterans, came back from the war, ended up getting 100% disability. He was mentally ill. He became an alcoholic. And where I want to start my story with you is on a summer night in Oklahoma City at 3517 South Independence, in a little white house. You see, my father had gotten me and my sister 2 kittens. One was black and one was gold. I loved those kittens. Our house, we didn't have air conditioning, and we didn't have one of those swamp coolers in the window. All we had was a little oscillating fan, and the coolest place on the floor was laying on the linoleum and letting that fan blow on me. And I'd play with those kittens, and they'd bite me, they'd scratch me, they'd chase feathers. I loved those 2 kittens. And one night my dad had been down at the bar. As usual, came home drunk, and I could tell by the way the brakes squealed in the driveway that it was going to be bad. I thought to myself, I ought to take the kittens to the bedroom. But I didn't. When he came in the door, he wanted to see the little black one, and I handed it to him, and he held him up and talked to him in a drunk baby talk, and I'm sure that little kitten hated his stinking breath as much as I did. And he reached out and he scratched him on the nose, and my father reached up and he looked at the blood. Part of his mental illness was paranoia, and he had guns all over the house, stuck between all the cushions on the furniture. He said, "Give me that other cat." And he grabbed both of them in one hand, and he reached down between a cushion on a chair, and he pulled out a .22 pistol. He took him out on the front porch, and he shot them both in the head. The next morning I got up and I looked in the garbage, and I looked in the yard, I looked under the house, I looked in the gutter. I looked in the ditch across the road. I couldn't find the kittens. I don't know when the last time you had Cracker Jacks. When I was a kid, I think they were 10 or 15 cents, and this was $1.19. But Cracker Jacks used to have a commercial that said, "Some kids never grow up." On that night in Oklahoma City, little Jimmy Likens stopped growing up. I vowed that I would never love anything again in my entire life, and I vowed that I would never, ever let my father see me cry. Nothing was ever said about those kittens. 35 years later, in talking to my mother, she told me, she said, "Jimmy, that story never happened. What are you talking about?" I sent her a picture of me, my sister, the 2 little kittens, and her. In 1987, my grandmother died. I had been in therapy with a therapist for depression and post-traumatic stress disorder, being the child of an alcoholic. And I told her I was going to have to miss my next appointment because I was going to Oklahoma City for the funeral. She said, "Well, where are you going to stay?" I said, "Well, I'm going to stay with my parents." She said, "Oh, Jim, I would advise against that." She said, "Where you are in your therapy and your rage, you very well might kill him." She said, "And if you go and stay there," she said, I can't be your counselor anymore." I said, "Nancy, I've got a debt to collect from the SOB, and I'm going to do it. It's been nice working with you." Well, when I arrived in Oklahoma City, my mother picked me up at the airport, and we went by the house before we went to the funeral home the first time to see Grandma. And my father came out of his room and sat on the couch, and before he could say anything, I said, I've been working with this therapist about being an adult child of an alcoholic, and she wanted me to ask you a question. Why did you hurt me so much?" He told me the story of how his mother had molested him the first 14 years of his life. How the day his father died in 1938, after his mother had gotten off the phone, he told her, he said, "If you ever touch me again, I will kill you." I looked at him and I thought to myself, I have come to collect a debt from a bankrupt man. Flew back to Indianapolis, where I was a pastor, and I had told people in Bible studies and sermons, that statement, forgive and forget, well, you're never going to forget. But what forgiveness is for a human, and I suppose for our Father in heaven too, because he placed his wrath on his Son, it's giving up the right to be angry. One night I took a long hot bath, and I was laying in this bathtub, and I kind of slumped down in the water where the water covered my ears, and the only thing I could hear was my heartbeat. And I looked up at the ceiling and I said, "Jesus, I give up my right to be angry at my Father." It was like I was lifted up out of that water, and if the ceiling hadn't been there, I would have been the third person in history to have gone to heaven alive, because that's how high I would have floated. Because you see, what I used to tell people is when you forgive someone else, the real beneficiary is you, but I had never experienced that. But I did that night. About 10 years later, I was in Indianapolis, Indiana, and my phone rang. And it was Uncle Walt, and he said, "Jimmy, I'm at Baptist Hospital with your father, and I don't think he's going to make it." I said, "Well, Walt, put the phone up to his ears." And he said, "Well, Jimmy, he's not going to be able to hear you." And I said, "Walt, what I have to say isn't for him." And he put the phone up to his ears. I said, "I love you." I never told you that I forgave you because I knew you wouldn't understand what I was forgiving you for. But I forgive you. I forgive you for all that you did. And then I said something that I don't think I'd said since I was 9 years old. "I love you, Daddy." He's dead. St. Paul in his letter to the Corinthians in the 13th chapter said, "When I was a child, I thought like a child, I acted like a child. When I became a man, I put away childish things." My father used to tell me that a man never grows up until his father dies. I guess, like the Cracker Jacks thing, it might be wrong, because on that night in Indianapolis, I did grow up. And what I found through all of that was the marvelous gift of forgiveness. They say a child has a pretty good image of their Father in heaven, which is correlated pretty well with what their father's like. I was terrified of God for a long time. It's nice to say to him, I really love you, Daddy. Thanks for listening to my story.